Hello. Before we begin, a quick note. The Bore You to Sleep podcast relies on you and sponsors, which means you will hear a quick advertisement before the beginning of tonight's episode. While the podcast is free, you are welcome to subscribe for just $2.99 per month, which supports the creation of this podcast and gives you an ad-free listening experience. Simply click the link in the show notes from your podcast app. Rest easy.
At Sierra, you'll always find apparel, footwear, and gear for 20 to 60% less than department and specialty store prices. But right now it's clearance time, so you can save even more on everything you need to get active and outside. Visit your local Sierra store today.
Hello. Welcome to the Bore You to Sleep podcast. The podcast that will hopefully help you get to sleep. I am going to read an open source book, one that is not particularly interesting, but one that is hopefully boring enough to get you to sleep. Tonight's reading comes from The Social Contract Discourse, originally published in 1762. This book was written by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. My name is Teddy, and I aim to help people everywhere get a good night's rest. Sleep is so important, and my mission is to help you get the rest you need. The podcast is designed to play in the background while you slowly fall asleep. For those of you who are new to the podcast, you may not know that it started from my own struggles with sleep. I wanted to create a resource for others facing similar challenges, and I'm so grateful for the amazing community we've built together. The podcast is self-made and self-produced. This is why you hear a short ad at the beginning of each episode. These ads, along with support from subscribers and Patreons, enable me to keep delivering this podcast for free to those who need it. Thank you to everyone who shared their words of gratitude with me during the week, whether through the website or through your podcast app. Your messages mean the world to me. My goal, as I said, is to keep this podcast free and accessible to everyone. If you find the podcast beneficial and would like to support it, there are a few ways you can contribute. Simply by following the podcast in your podcast app and leaving a comment. Or you can become a subscriber for $2.99 per month, simply by clicking on the link in the show notes. This also creates for an ad-free experience. If subscribing is not possible, an easy way to help is simply by leaving a review and rating in your podcast app. Even one sentence really helps out. Another way to show gratitude is by sharing the podcast with a friend or loved one who also needs a good night's rest. In the meantime, lie back, relax, and enjoy the readings. The Social Contract Discourses by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Introduction. For the study of the great writers and thinkers of the past, historical imagination is the first necessity. Without mentally referring to the environment in which they lived, we cannot hope to penetrate below the inessential and temporary to the absolute and permanent value of their thought. Theory, no less than action, is subject to these necessities. The form in which men cast their speculations, no less than the ways in which they behave, are the result of habits of thought and action which they find around them. Great men make, indeed, individual contributions to the knowledge of their times, but they can never transcend the age in which they live. The questions they try to answer will always be those their contemporaries are asking. Their statement of fundamental problems will always be relative to the traditional statements that have been handed down to them. When they are stating what is most startlingly new, they will be most likely to put it in an old-fashioned form, and to use the inadequate ideas and formulae of tradition to express the deeper truths towards which they are feeling their way. They will be most the children of their age, when they are rising most above it. Rousseau had suffered much as anyone from critics without a sense of history. He has been cried up and cried down by democrats and oppressors, with an equal lack of understanding and imagination. His name, 150 years after the publication of the Social Contract, is still a controversial watchword and a party cry. He is accepted as one of the greatest writers France has ever produced, but even now men are inclined, as political bias prompts them, to accept or reject his political doctrines as a whole, without sifting them or attempting to understand and discriminate. He is still revered or hated as the author who, above all others, inspired the French Revolution. At the present day, his works possess a double significance. They are important historically, alike as giving us an insight into the mind of the 18th century, and for the actual influence they have had on the course of events in Europe. Certainly, no other writer of the time has exercised such an influence as his. He may fairly be called the parent of the Romantic movement in art, letters, and life. He affected profoundly the German Romantics and Goethe himself. He set the fashion of a new introspection, which has permeated 19th century literature. He began modern educational theory, and above all, in political thought, he represents the passage from a traditional theory rooted in the Middle Ages to the modern philosophy of the state. His influence on Kant's moral philosophy and on Hegel's philosophy of right are two sides of the same fundamental contribution to modern thought. He is, in fact, the great forerunner of German and English idealism. It would not be possible, in the course of a short introduction, to deal both with the positive content of Rousseau's thought and with the actual influence he has had on practical affairs. The statesmen of the French Revolution, from Robespierre downwards, were throughout profoundly affected by the study of his works. Though they seem often to have misunderstood him, they had on the whole studied him with the attention he demands. In the 19th century, men continued to appeal to Rousseau, without, as a rule, knowing him well or penetrating deeply into his meaning. The Social Contract, says M. Dreyfus Brissac, is the book of all books that is most talked of and least read. But with the great revival of interest in political philosophy, there has come a desire for the better understanding of Rousseau's work. He is again being studied more as a thinker and less as an ally or an opponent. There is more eagerness to sift the true from the false, and to seek in the social contract the principles of political right, rather than the great revolutionaries ipse dixit, in favour of some view about circumstances which he could never have contemplated. The social contract, then, may be regarded either as a document of the French Revolution or as one of the greatest books dealing with political philosophy. It is in the second capacity, as a work of permanent value containing truth, that it finds a place among the world's greatest books. It is in that capacity also that it will be treated in this introduction. Taking it in this aspect, we have no less need of historical insight than if we came to it as historians, pure and simple. To understand its value, we must grasp its limitations. When the questions it answers seem unnaturally put, we must not conclude that they are meaningless. We must see if the answer still holds when the question is put in a more up-to-date form. First, then, we must always remember that Rousseau is writing in the 18th century, and for the most part in France. Neither the French monarchy nor the Genevese aristocracy loved outspoken criticism, and Rousseau had always to be careful what he said. This may seem a curious statement to make about a man who suffered continual persecution on account of his subversive doctrines, but although Rousseau was one of the most daring writers of his time, he was forced continually to moderate his language and, as a rule, to confine himself to generalization, instead of attacking particular abuses. Rousseau's theory has often been described as too abstract and metaphysical. This is in many ways its great strength, but where it is excessively so, the accident of time is to blame. In the 18th century, it was, broadly speaking, safe to generalize and unsafe to particularize. Skepticism and discontent were the prevailing temper of the intellectual classes, and a short-sighted despotism held that, as long as they were confined to these, they would do little harm. Subversive doctrines were only regarded as dangerous when they were so put as to appeal to the masses. Philosophy was regarded as impotent. The intellectuals of the 18th century therefore generalized to their heart's content, and as a rule suffered little for their lèse-majesté. Voltaire is the typical example of such generalization. The spirit of the age favoured such methods, and it was therefore natural for Rousseau to pursue them. But his general remarks had such a way of bearing very obvious, particular applications, and were so obviously inspired by a particular attitude towards the government of his day, that even philosophy became in his hands unsafe, and he was attacked for what men read between the lines of his works. It is owing to this faculty of giving his generalizations content and actuality that Rousseau has become the father of modern political philosophy. He uses the method of his time only to transcend it. Out of the abstract and general he creates the concrete and universal. Secondly, we must not forget that Rousseau's theories are to be studied in a wider historical environment. If he is the first of modern political theorists, he is also the last of a long line of Renaissance theorists, who in turn inherit and transform the concepts of medieval thought. So many critics have spent so much wasted time in proving that Rousseau was not original only because they began identifying originality with isolation. They studied first the social contract by itself, out of relation to earlier works, and then, having discovered that these earlier works resembled it, decided that everything it had to say was borrowed. Had they begun their study in a truly historical spirit, they would have seen that Rousseau's importance lies just in the new use he makes of old ideas, in the transition he makes from old to new in the general conception of politics. No mere innovator could have exercised such an influence or hit on so much truth. Theory makes no great leaps. It proceeds to new concepts by the adjustment and renovation of old ones. Just as theological writers on politics, from Hooker to Bossuet, make use of biblical terminology and ideas, just as more modern writers, from Hegel to Herbert Spencer, make use of the concept of evolution, Rousseau uses the ideas and terms in the social contract theory. We should feel throughout his work his struggle to free himself from what is lifeless and outworn in that theory, while he develops out of it fruitful conceptions that go beyond its scope. A too rigid literalism in the interpretation of Rousseau's thought may easily reduce it to the possession of a merely historical interest. If we approach it in a truly historical spirit, we shall be able to appreciate it all at once in its temporary and lasting value, to see how it served his contemporaries, and at the same time to disentangle from it that which may be serviceable to us and for all time. Rousseau's Emily, the greatest of all works on education, has already been issued in this series. In this volume are contained the most important of his political works. Of these, the Social Contract, by the far most significant, is the latest in date. It represents the maturity of his thought, while the other works only illustrate his development. Born in 1712, he issued no work of importance till 1750, but he tells us in the Confessions that in 1743, when he was attached to the embassy at Venice, he had already conceived the idea of a great work on political institutions, which was to put the seal on his reputation. He seems, however, to have made little progress with this work, until in 1749 he happened to light on the announcement of a prize, offered by the Academy of Dijon for an answer to the question, has the progress of the arts and sciences tended to the purification or to the corruption of morality? His old ideas came thronging back, and sick at heart of the life he had been leading among the Paris Lumiere, he composed a violent and rhetorical diatribe against civilization generally. In the following year, this work, having been awarded the prize by the Academy, was published by its author. His success was instantaneous. He became at once a famous man, the lion of Parisian literary cycles. Refutations of his work were issued by professors, scribblers, outraged theologians, and even by the King of Poland. Rousseau endeavoured to answer them all, and in the course of argument his thought developed. From 1750 to the publication of the Social Contract d'Andamil in 1762, he gradually evolved his views. In those 12 years, he had made his unique contribution to political thought. The Discourse on the Arts and Sciences, the earliest of the works reproduced in this volume, is not in itself of very great importance. Rousseau has given his opinion of it in the Confessions. Full of warmth and force, it is wholly without logic or order. Of all my works, it is the weakest in argument, and the least harmonious. But whatever gifts a man may be born with, he cannot learn the art of writing in a moment. This criticism is just. The first discourse neither is, nor attempts to be, a reasoned or a balanced production. It is the speech of an advocate, wholly one-sided and arbitrary, but so obviously and naively one-sided that it is difficult for us to believe in its entire seriousness. At the most, it is only a rather brilliant but flimsy rhetorical effort, a sophistical improvisation, but not a serious contribution to thought. Yet it is certain that this declamation made Rousseau's name, and established his position as a great writer in Parisian circles. D'Alembert even devoted the preface of the Encyclopedia to a refutation. The plan of the first discourse is essentially simple. It sets out from the badness, immorality, and misery of modern nations, traces all the ills to the departure from a natural state, and then credits the progress of the arts and sciences with being the cause of that departure. In it, Rousseau is already in possession of his idea of nature as an ideal, but he has at present made no attempt to discriminate, in what is unnatural, between good and bad. He is merely using a single idea, putting it as strongly as he can, and neglecting all its limitations. The first discourse is important not for any positive doctrine it contains, but as a key to the development of Rousseau's mind. Here we see him at the beginning of the long journey, which was to lead on at last to the theory of the social contract. In 1755 appeared the Discourse on the Origin and Foundation of Inequality among Men, which is the second of the works given in this volume. With this essay, Rousseau has unsuccessfully competed in 1753 for a second prize offered by the Academy of Dijon, and he now issued it prefaced by a long dedication to the Republic of Geneva. In this work, which Voltaire, in thanking him for a presentation copy, termed his second book against the human race, his style and his ideas have made a great advance. He is no longer content merely to push a single idea to extremes, while preserving the broad opposition between the state of nature and the state of society, which runs through all his work. He is concerned to present a rational justification of his views, and to admit that a little at any rate may be said on the other side. Moreover, the idea of nature has already undergone a great development. It is no longer an empty opposition to the evils of society. It possesses a positive content. Thus, half the discourse on inequality is occupied by an imaginary description of the state of nature, in which man is shown with ideas limited within the narrowest range, with little need of his fellows, and little care beyond provision for the necessities of the moment. Rousseau declares explicitly that he does not suppose the state of nature ever to have existed. It is a pure idea of reason, a working concept reached by abstraction from the state of society. The natural man, as opposed to man's man, is man stripped of all that society confers upon him, a creature formed by a process of abstraction and never intended for a historical portrait. The conclusion of the discourse favors not this purely abstract being, but a state of savagery intermediate between the natural and the social conditions, in which men may preserve the simplicity and the advantages of nature, and at the same time secure the rude comforts and assurances of early society. In one of the long notes appended to the discourse, Rousseau further explains his position. He does not wish, he says, the modern corrupt society should return to a state of nature. Corruption has gone too far for that. He only desires now that men should palliate by wiser use of the fatal arts the mistake of their introduction. He recognizes society as inevitable and is already feeling his way towards a justification of it. The second discourse represents a second stage in his political thought. The opposition between the state of nature and the state of society is still presented in naked contrast, but the picture of the former has already filled out, and it only remains for Rousseau to take a nearer view of the fundamental implications of the state of society for his thought to reach maturity. Rousseau is often blamed by modern critics for pursuing in the discourses a method apparently that of history, but in reality wholly unhistorical. But it must be remembered that he himself lays no stress on the historical aspect of his work. He gives himself out as constructing a purely ideal picture, and not as depicting any actual stages in human history. The use of false historical concepts is characteristic of the 17th and 18th centuries, and Rousseau is more to be congratulated on having escaped from giving them too much importance than criticized for employing them at all. It is doubtful whether the discourse on political economy, first printed in the great encyclopedia of 1755, was composed before or after the discourse of inequality. At first sight, the former seems to be far more in the manner of the social contract, and to contain views belonging essentially to Rousseau's constructive period. It would not, however, be safe to conclude from this that its date is really later. The discourse on inequality still has about it much of the rhetorical looseness of the prize essay. It aims not so much at close reasoning as at effective and popular presentation of a case. But by reading between the lines, an alternative student can detect in it a great deal of the positive doctrine afterwards incorporated in the social contract. Especially in the closing section, which lays down the plan of a general treatment of the fundamental questions of politics, we are already to some extent in the atmosphere of the later works. It is indeed almost certain that Rousseau never attempted to put into either of the first two discourses any of the positive content of his political theory. They were intended not as final expositions of his point of view, but as partial and preliminary studies in which his aim was far more destructive than constructive. It is clear that in first conceiving the plan of a work on political institutions, Rousseau cannot have meant to regard all society as in essence bad. It is indeed evident that he meant, from the first, to study human society and institutions in their rational aspect, and that he was rather diverted from his main purpose by the Academy of Dijon's competition than first induced by it to think about political questions. It need, therefore, cause no surprise that a work probably written before the Discourse on Inequality should contain the germs of the theory given in full in the Social Contract. The Discourse on Political Economy is important as giving the first sketch of the theory of the general will. It will readily be seen that Rousseau does not mean by political economy exactly what we mean nowadays. He begins with a discussion of the fundamental nature of the state, and the possibility of reconciling its existence with human liberty, and goes on with an admirable short study of the principles of taxation. He is thinking throughout of political in the sense of public economy, of the state as the public financier, and not of the conditions governing industry. He conceives the state as a body aiming at the well-being of all its members and subordinates, all his views of taxation to that end. He who has only necessaries should not be taxed at all. Superfluities should be supertaxed. There should be heavy imposts on every sort of luxury. The first part of the article is still more interesting. Rousseau begins by demolishing the exaggerated parallel so often drawn between the state and the family. He shows that the state is not, and cannot be, patriarchal in nature, and goes on to lay down his view that its real being consists in the general will of its members. The essential features of the social contract are present in this discourse, almost as if they were commonplaces, certainly not as if they were new discoveries on which the author had just hit by some happy inspiration. There is every temptation, after reading the political economy, to suppose that Rousseau's political ideas really reached maturity far earlier than has generally been allowed. The Social Contract finally appeared along with Emile in 1762. This year, therefore, represents in every respect the culmination of Rousseau's career. Henceforth, he has to write only controversial and confessional works. His theories were now developed, and simultaneously he gave to the world his views on the fundamental problems of politics and education. It is now time to ask what Rousseau's system, in its maturity, finally amounted to. The Social Contract contains practically the whole of his constructive political theory. It requires to be read, for full understanding, in connection with his other works, especially Emile and the Letters on the Mount, 1764. The title sufficiently defines its scope. It is called the Social Contract or Principles of Political Right, and the second title explains the first. Rousseau's object is not to deal in a general way, like the Montesquieu, with the actual institutions of existing states, but to lay down the essential principles which must form the basis of every legitimate society. Rousseau himself, in the 5th book of the Emile, has stated the difference clearly. Montesquieu, he says, did not intend to treat of the principles of political right. He was content to treat of the positive right or law of established governments, and no two studies could be more different than these. Rousseau then conceives his object as being something very different from that of the spirit of the laws. It is a wilful error to misconstrue his purpose. Not contemptuous of facts, he is merely asserting to be sure principle, that a fact can in no case give rise to a right. His desire is to establish society on a basis of pure thought, so as at once to disprove his attack on society generally, and to reinforce his criticism of existing societies. Round this point centres the whole dispute about the methods proper to political theory. There are, broadly speaking, two schools of political theorists. If we set aside the psychologists, one school, by collecting facts, aims at reaching broad generalizations about what actually happens in human societies. The other tries to penetrate to the universal principles at the root of all human combination. For the latter, purpose facts may be useful, but in themselves they can prove nothing. The question is not one of fact, but one of right. And that concludes tonight's readings. I hope you've enjoyed listening to this story. If you're not quite tired yet, you're always welcome to listen to another episode of the Boy to Sleep podcast. Until next time, good night.